All right, welcome. We have on tonight's show Lindsay Bassett, and she'll be talking to us about the pre-colonial farming era of South Africa. All right, Lindsay, I have a few questions for you. I've been looking at your research, and something that I've grown very interested in is knowing about the Bantu people during the pre-colonial farming era, and how they settled in homesteads. This brought a variety of advantages for the Bantu people when developing a reliable agricultural system. I want you to elaborate on what type of advantages this brought to the people and how these advantages further expanded their agricultural system.
So the homesteads were areas where the Bantu people settled in. They had rich soil and water that could be used for a great agricultural system. This helped them grow grains such as sorghum and wheat, which helped feed their growing population, as well as they raised livestock such as sheep, which could be used for fur, and they had goats and cattle, which were used for meat and milk.
All right, my next question for you is, for those who did not settle in the homesteads, however, became hunters and gatherers, as your research shows, what were their duties for the tribe, and what did they entail? What did they have to do? How were they portrayed by the rest of the people who lived in these homesteads?
And they traded work on the farms for livestock that they could use in their hunting and gathering. And they were kind of seen as lower class citizens and wild savages by the farmers, and there was rarely intermarriage between the groups.
Okay, very interesting. My next question has to do with men and women both having their individual duties within the tribe. How were men seen in the tribe, and how were women seen in the tribe from the rest of the
So they lived in a certain pattern called the central cattle pattern. So in the center was the men's sphere, where men worked. They worked in the metal areas, and this is where the cattle was kept and raised. And the important decisions were made here in the men's court, whereas women were expected to stay in huts in a ring outside the center, and they worked in the home raising children and cooking and cleaning, and they were not given any political power. And there was a bride wealth system where men could trade cattle for wives, so women were not even given decision making in marriage.
Okay, very interesting. My fourth and final question for you has to do with when it came time for the Bantu people to bury their dead. There were certain rituals, which I see here, that they believed in. What were these rituals, and why were they significant to the Bantu people?
So the men were buried in the center, where they had worked, and the women and children were buried in courtyards behind the homes. And this reflects the patrilineal ancestry system, where men were only given their wealth and inheritance by their male parent rather than their mother. And it also reflects the system where the ancestors' spirits were seen as kind of good luck by existing in the center of the home, or the center of the working area, where they could oversee the daily work lives.
Very interesting. All right, Lindsay, I want to thank you for coming out tonight and letting me interview you. This was a blast. Good evening. Welcome to the Milwaukee Show. I'm your host, TJ Alterman, and tonight I'm going to be interviewing Augie Coltrip. Special guest. How's it going, Augie? Thank you for coming.
Thank you, man. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
We're extremely excited to have you.
Oh, I'm excited to be here.
First question for you. When did South Africa break away from the Paleolithic pre-colonial era?
Well, so you see this period of pre-colonial farming and hunter-gatherers, they festered throughout South Africa until the middle of the next millennia, like Lindsay was talking about with you earlier. And this is when the Khoi people eventually reached the most southern point of South Africa. And so this is when the African people were first introduced to sea ship trading, which, we can't imagine that because we've always known that in our history. But although the European vessels frequently passed through South Africa on their way to East Africa and India, the first European settlement was established in 1652 with Jan van Riebeck and his other 90-person crew. They set up the first provisioning station of the Dutch East India Company at Table Bay, which a provisioning station is more of where just ships would stop and fill up on food and grain and everything to keep on their voyage. And so this first establishment was actually the foundation for the first city in South Africa, and it was
very
Cape
interesting.
Town.
Cape Town. Oh, South
Yeah,
Africa,
which is
okay.
today the second biggest city.
Yeah, I mean, here the place is beautiful too. You got
Oh, yeah.
Tabletop
Oh, yeah.
Island, you got soccer.
They
teams,
say if you
everything
spend
down
less
there,
than
culture.
5 days there on a vacation, you will want to go back.
Oh, yeah,
You need.
I'm sure.
There's so much to go to. Oh, but yeah. So this is the very original start of when South Africa got its first colonial city.
Okay, very
Yeah,
cool. Now,
yeah.
my next question, obviously, like, I want you to explain to us what the Dutch East Indian Company is.
Oh, perfect, man. So the Dutch East India Company, formerly known as the VOC, which is some long word for how you say it in Dutch, obviously. It was an early mega corporation founded by the government-directed collaboration of several other Dutch rivalry companies.
Okay.
And this happened in the early 17th century. It was originally established in 1602. It was a charter company. They traded with India and Indianized Southeast Asian countries. The company has often been labeled a trading company or sometimes a shipping company. The company was a transcontinental employer, outward foreign direct investments. The company's investment project helped raise the commercial and industrial potential of underdeveloped and undeveloped countries. It helped with many regions in the early modern period. It was in the early 1600s, the VOC became the world's first formally listed public company. So, for layman's term, that would be one of the first companies, or I guess according to this, the first company to trade on a public stock market. The VOC was influential in the rise of the corporate-led globalization of early modern periods. They really, really helped distribute goods and services.
Well, going off that, what effect did the VOC have on the South African economy and for their culture?
Okay, so like I was saying, the VOC really set up this provision settlement on the in Cape Town, well, on the Cape of Good Hope, which is right below Cape Town, the very southernmost tip of South Africa, just to literally supply their ships to go on up into like India and whatnot. Well, not to go up into India, but to traverse on their way through their travels. Well, the indigenous population was the Khoi people on this point of South Africa. And they officially said, at first they were trading with them, and then they said, no, we don't want to trade with you guys anymore. You guys are invasive. You're coming into our land. We're losing land. So actually the Cape and the VOC had to import Dutch farmers to establish a farm to supply the passing ships as well as supply the growing VOC settlement. The small initial group of freeburgers, as these farmers were known, which are ex-VOC contractors, steadily increased their numbers and began to expand their farms further north and into the territory of the Khoi, which are the indigenous groups of Africa at this time, South Africa at this time. And so the freeburgers and the ex-VOC soldiers and gardeners were not able to return to Holland with their contracts once they completed their time with the VOC. The VOC also brought about 71,000 slaves because, get this, they didn't want to enslave the indigenous people because they thought that was impolite. Crazy, right? So they actually voted in 71,000 slaves. These slaves came from India, Indonesia, East Africa, Mauritius, and Madagascar. But then, so that's crazy, right? And so then, but then eventually, Van John Vriebach, the guy that made this first provision settlement on the coast of South Africa, he began to make the Khoi people indentured servants. And so that, as you can tell, once we have all these different agglomerations of groups of people, breeding happens, and the offsprings from this miscegenation between the Dutch settlers and the Khoi and the San and the Malay slaves became known officially as the Cape Colored and the Cape Malays, respectively. The racially mixed genealogical origins of many so-called white South Africans have been traced to interracial unions at the Cape between the European occupying populations and the imported Asian and African slaves, as well as the indigenous Khoi and San and their very hued offsprings.
Well, what was the aftermath for this?
Yeah, so
what was the reason
obviously
for
the
the
VOC,
VOC's
they're
demise,
this big mega corporation. They're coming into the land, and they definitely start getting people try to rival them. So in the 1670s, the VOC committed itself to establishing a permanent settlement on the Cape. So before we just had this provision, now we got a permanent settlement. Thanks for this, I appreciate it.
Of course.
So the growing influence of the British and the French, who also had interest in this Cape, they posed danger to the Dutch, because the Dutch were like, you want our place, we got it already. Because it was a very strategic location. Everybody's got to go around the Cape of Good Hope to go up. And so in 1670s, the French attacked Saadal Bay, exposing the vulnerability of the settlement. And then when the war broke out between the United Provinces of the Netherlands, which is the Netherlands is where the Dutch are from, against the British troops and the French troops, the VOC declared itself the rightful owner of the Cape District in 1672. The Dutch claimed that they had purchased the land from the leader of the Khoi group, which a lot of people don't. There's iffiness with that we don't know if they actually purchased it or what's or not. But they say they purchased it with brandy, tobacco, and bread, which great resources. Thus, the order to set up a permanent settlement was an attempt by the Dutch to exclude the British, with whom the Dutch were at war. So in 1795, the British, who were at war with France, invaded Cape Peninsula from the False Bay Inlet and took over the Cape, including Cape Town, putting the VOC in financial ruins, actually. And then this led to its eventual dissolution.
That explains the demise.
Yeah. So then, under the terms of the peace agreement between England and France, the Cape was then returned to the Dutch in 1802. It was a peace agreement. I forget the actual name, but however, 3 years later, the war resumed between France and Britain, and Britain took back over the Cape. So, yeah.
Well, you know what? Augie, I want to thank you for coming out.
Oh man, it's been a pleasure.
Let's hear a round of applause for Augie. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Milwaukee Show. I'm joined tonight by special guest Will Thiessen. Let's give him a round of applause. Thanks for joining us. Good to see you. All right, Will. So I got a couple questions for you.
Of course.
Explain to me what the apartheid is and when it was put in place.
So the apartheid is defined as discrimination and racial segregation by law. It's translated from the Afrikaans word meaning apartness. It was originally introduced by the National Party, or NP, government in 1948. The original law was implemented with the description of calling for equal development and freedom and cultural expression, though it resulted in separate development of racial groups in South Africa. The laws that were passed actually severely hindered the opportunity for growth within society for Native people.
All right, well, what specific laws were in place and under the apartheid?
So there are a few laws, but there were three main pillars. The first of which was the Population Registration Act in 1950. This act would force people to be registered according to their race. So since they're registered according to race, it would lead to differential and discriminatory treatment, unfortunately. And then the second law, which resulted in the most drastic and detrimental impact, was the Group Areas Act of 1950. As the name states, this was the physical segregation of people of different races. This resulted in people of different races having no ability to grow and develop outside of their own culture, and therefore fall behind in society since they had less opportunities than that of the race in power. Although not considered a pillar that drove the apartheid, another consequential act was the Bantu Authorities Act. This act established what were called homelands. These were independent states within South Africa where Native Africans were forced to live. So by isolating them, the governing state would be able to impose more harsh and discriminating conditions upon them. One of these conditions was denying them the right to vote. This was done by making people who lived in the homeland citizens of the homelands and no longer citizens of Africa, and therefore taking away some of the rights that they were given at birth. So the third pillar was the promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act in 1959. This was an expansion to the Group Areas Act, which essentially forced black people to live in the remote and small plots of land. So it's kind of like the same thing as the Bantu Authorities Act, where they were all put in these homelands. And their seclusion from the cities and towns limited opportunities for the communities to develop at the same rate as city dwellers. Additionally, due to the lack of infrastructure in these remote towns, people living in these communities did not have the chance to work in a larger city, which again posed a limitation on their economic development.
Well, that raises a question for me. How did the apartheid affect the people of South Africa?
So I went into it a little bit, but basically, since the aim of the apartheid was to maintain white domination and extend racial separation, people of other races were discriminated against in all ways of life. In some ways, it was actually quite similar to life in America for African Americans during the mid-1900s. In most predominantly white neighborhoods and areas, the native African people were not allowed to use the same restrooms as white people. Since they were forced to live in areas outside cities and towns, they were ultimately unable to find sustainable work that could advance their lives into the modern area.
Well, Will, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I had a good time talking with you. Sleep tight, Milwaukee.
Did you have that shirt?
All right, welcome to tonight's Milwaukee show. Tonight we are interviewing special guest Milwaukee native Alex Reimer. How's it going, Alex?
How's it going, man?
Good to see you. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. So I was looking over your research on South Africa, and I raised a few questions for you, if you don't mind me asking.
No, go ahead, man.
Awesome, I love it. All right, so my first question, what actions has the South African government taken since 1994 to ensure equal rights for all their citizens?
Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked. So in 1994, the apartheid government ended in South Africa, which was big for the people in South Africa. In 1994, that apartheid government was actually replaced by the constitutional democracy that still exists. So I'm sure you've seen South African flag. You know, it's the rainbow, the multicolored flag, and that was actually adapted after this apartheid government ended. So after this dictatorship ended and some more constitutional freedoms were beginning to be installed to their people, that's when South Africa really tried to change their name. They changed their style of government, as I mentioned, changed their flag, created a democratic voting process for their all people. So yeah, that 1994 year was big. It was big. I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, definitely. My next question, with the government that now supports equal treatment, has racism truly been put to rest in South Africa, or does it continue to flourish?
Well, to be honest, it still exists, unfortunately.
That's a bummer.
Yeah, that is a bummer. It still is a major issue in South Africa, even with the new government put in place. A lot of the members of the South African government are, in fact, native Africans, people of color, minorities. But fortunately, even with a lot of black individuals in their government, it still is a country that is controlled majority by the white population. Even though the population numbers about 60% Native Africans and about 40% whites, it still is a government that is controlled by the white population. A lot of the schools have unfair and equal treatment. Their economy is almost entirely dominated by white individuals and racism that still exists.
In what ways is racism still a prominent issue in modern day South Africa?
Well, as I mentioned, a black government does preside over a white-dominated economy, and which frequently ranks among the most unequal in the world. Economic inequality is said to have exploded after the end of the apartheid, which is interesting. So even though the government was, in fact, more racist before the apartheid government ended, its economic equality decreased, which is interesting, with the wealth of the top 10% growing by 64% in the first 17 years while the poorest 10% have seen no significant financial growth. So basically, you've seen the rich people that are at the top get richer and the poor people at the bottom stay the same, which is a surprising change even with the new changes in their government after 1994. But yeah. Mind if I take a little sip of this?
Yeah, go ahead. That's for you. Thank you for coming, Alex. We appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me, man.
That's the Milwaukee Show, ladies and gentlemen. Good night. Woo!